Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about what is really a worldwide space race. We've got Russia launching still. China is putting stuff up. Japan. We've got Iran attempting to put things up and actually putting some space junk up. We've got others involved. Jim, where's this all going from a military standpoint?
Well, the problem is the offense. Who has the capability to disable, destroy, or even modify other people's satellites in wartime or not in wartime? There are fears that the enemy is going to conduct a undeclared war against satellite capabilities. Now, right now, we're the most vulnerable. There are over 1,000 satellites, operational satellites up there, and most of them are Western. Most of them are American. With SpaceX, we are becoming, ascendant, as it were, in terms of launching. The Russians are having terrible problems: quality control, lack of money. They are basically, on a nosedive, towards the basement, but they're still number 3. They used to be number 2 for a long time, but the Chinese surpassed them. The Chinese, however, are still using Russian technology. Now, that is good news, because if you impose a certain degree of quality control, which the Russians lost, the stuff works, but the Chinese are having problems. And, of course, they haven't got SpaceX yet. But don't be too surprised if you see that showing up. The technology that SpaceX developed has been, how should I put it, known for a long time. Nobody actually got it to work. Given how secure, American corporation networks are, the Chinese may have already or are hard at work trying to get in there and save themselves a lot of work. It doesn't give them basically a green light, because while getting the technical details, it still takes a while to develop the manufacturing finesse. That's something that people tend to forget. It's what kept the Russians in distant second place during the Cold War, and it's one reason the Chinese have not, for example, been able to manufacture military-grade engines to the same degree that not just the United States, but also Britain and France have been able to do. But they are, like I say, they're hard at work at it. The one thing the Chinese have to worry about is if the current morale problem, as the Chinese like to put it, in China, gets worse. Chinese people are not happy with their emperor. Their chairman.
No, you got it right.
In fact, many, especially in the South, that's where the saying, the mountains are tall and the emperor is far away. Well, he's a lot closer now, and that's where most of the innovation, not just Hong Kong, but the province just north of Hong Kong, that is where a lot of the economic progress has been made in the last 30 years. Now, that's stalling now. In fact, the current economist's prediction is that China will have no GDP growth in 2020. Now, they're rapidly trying to hide exactly the damage done by COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, as they don't like to call it. But again, because of the internet and their imperfect Great Firewall of China, details are getting out, and they're not looking very good. But China is still the major contender, not the Russians. China is becoming more dependent on satellite technology, putting satellites up. They design and build their own. The Russians have been hurt in that department by the sanctions. They cannot get the latest chip technology from the West anymore, at least not legally, and you really can't import what you need. We're talking about access to the fabs, the fabrication plants. The Chinese, for some reason, well, the Chinese don't have the latest fab technology. They've been working on it. They by numbers, they have a lot of the fab manufacturing capability, but South Korea is right behind them, and so the West, in effect, has still has an edge there. But the Russians are crippled right now. They basically they've stopped making all sorts of industrial equipment, including satellites, and that's why their GLONASS, their version of GPS. They had it operational in the mid-'90s. The financial collapse after the Cold War ended made it impossible to keep refreshing the satellites. They had a new generation of GLONASS satellites that lasted, more than 5 years. It lasted about 7 years. They were in the midst of replacing those with the third generation, which lasts 10 years, when the sanctions hit. And now their GLONASS array, as it were, which is complete, is starting to disappear, one satellite at a time. China, meanwhile, finally got Baidu up there. That's all locally made stuff. May not be the latest and the greatest, but it's better than what the Russians got, and the Chinese can manufacture their own. So in terms of Space Force capabilities, the Chinese have the equipment to become a premier player, the number one player in offensive operations. Defensive operations is a different story. One of the first things the American Space Force went after, basically collected under their purview, are electronic devices for intercepting satellite signals, for protecting our own, and that technology is advancing. That basically allows you to do a lot of damage or a lot of defense from the ground. Getting the satellites up there is a problem because once they're up there, without the space shuttle or something like it, and that might be, and there's progress being made in using robots, which engineers and scientists have advocated for decades. It's really difficult to repair or maintain. Refueling is a big deal. Most satellites can last a lot longer, like our Keyhole, our premier spy satellites. They can last a lot longer if you can refuel them, because they're built to last. Some of them have lasted more than 20 years beyond their how should I put it, stated life. And if you can make little repairs and keep refueling them, you can keep them up there longer. That saves you a lot of money. Now, in theory, that space shuttle was supposed to solve that, but that's spun way out of control in terms of cost. And SpaceX is an enormous advantage over not just the existing, launchers, but also the space shuttle. So the price curve, as it usually does in technology, is going way, way down. And we can thank Mr. Musk for that, despite his use of recreational drugs, maybe because of. Because he has basically inspired a lot of the engineers and scientists who were already there, already existed. We're fed up with NASA. We're fed up with the Lockheed and who's the other? The two outfits that had basically a government subsidized monopoly, which is now gone. They're trying to stay in business, but they can't, because they haven't got the cost efficiencies that SpaceX has. And SpaceX is moving ahead. They're basically developing more and more landable components for launchers. And this is something that the Chinese are really concerned about, because if this gives us a large capability in putting up and replacing satellites, as well as and Musk also has a robotics operation, as any good, satellite launcher firm does. And it's not just self-driving cars he's been working on, but also robots that can repair other satellites. That is an enormous advantage. So the Space Force edge comes from technology. Well, that's no surprise, of course. But the question is, who has what technology, who is working on what technology, and who's likely to have what technology? And so far, we're looking pretty good in that department. But the Chinese have been extremely resourceful, and they depend a lot. Their military strategy right now, as it's published and as it can be deduced, even if you couldn't read, Chinese, from what they're actually, putting on the ground or into space, is to basically gain information superiority. Now, that depends not just on hacking and being able to manipulate the internet, etc., but also being able to disable satellites. And that's some place where Space Force may run into problems, because one of the better ideas before we had a new branch of the military was the Navy was pushing for putting a few of their Trident sea-launched ballistic missiles in the subs, not with nuclear warheads, but with CubeSats, communication satellites, maybe some large ones, but preferably smaller ones. CubeSats are a big deal. These are small satellites. I haven't got it up in front of me right now. We've done several articles on that, but one just recently. They have made huge jumps in technology and effectiveness. These are the satellites which for years were piggybacked on regular satellite launches. I mean, there was excess space, there was space, and there was volume and some weight, or left over. So it was really not much of an additional cost to stick in some CubeSats. A lot of the earlier ones were basically, college experiments. The satellite launcher people were pretty free with that because, hey, it was great publicity. But now it's become a commercial operation, and the Russians have taken to that. They were quick to go off the mark on that. They took some of their retired ICBMs, the old liquid fuel jobbies, and now they are capable of launching CubeSats. They were capable of launching smaller satellites, but now with CubeSat technology, they can launch a lot more satellites. And a lot of the new communications arrays, hundreds or 1,000 satellites going up there, these are basically CubeSats. So that goes to show you what can happen, when you have a large gaggle of these. But even a small gaggle, a half a dozen or a dozen of them working in concert for a specific purpose can basically replace a lot of the large satellites we have up there now for communications or, for military purposes. So it's basically, it's a good move to consolidate the Space Force capability. The question is, will the Space Force be able to wrangle the Navy? I mean, we had, when the SOCOM was established in the 80s, it took several decades to get the Marines to sign up. The Navy, to their credit, they were quick to basically incorporate their SEALs. And the Air Force, all they really had was the Air Sea Rescue, who are basically commando type folks, and some fixed wing aircraft. But it was the Army that contributed most of the SOCOM manpower. Now it's the Air Force who has a lot of the assets, and so they have no problem. They see the Space Force as a allied, as it were, a descendant of the Air Force, and they do have a very tight, link with that, because a lot of the senior people going in on the first generation are Air Force. I haven't been able to get any sense what the Navy is going to do, whether they're going to respond and jump in with as much as they can, or whether they're going to basically play, petulant child. That's Pentagon politics for you. So there we are. Theoretically, we're looking good. In practical terms, next year or so, time will tell.
Austin?
Let me just pick up on a couple of points that Jim made. He mentioned the U.S. advantage in electronic surveillance and being able to track transmissions up and transmissions down. I suspect, and this has appeared in a couple of things that Jim's written over the last 4 or 5 years on the space issue, that we've got advantages in unjamming as well. Now, is that defensive? Yeah, but it gives us an advantage in keeping our satellites providing information when someone tries to do it. And that's a tricky world out there, and it's also something you don't want to give away. But if our adversaries / enemies decide that they're going to blind an important satellite, as I say, one that's like the Sibers, that's involved in strategic missile defense, actually operational level missile defense as well, is that we can protect them from that kind of electronic assault. I'm not sure where our adversaries are. Maybe NSA and CIA have a better picture of it. Maybe they don't, but I suspect our adversaries believe or know we've got an advantage there, and it could be very big, Dan, in the initial stages as you approach a conflict, when suddenly our adversaries, thinking they're going to blind us, discover they can't. Therefore, it has a diplomatic information edge as well as military. Now, there's this. Jim's written about this. I haven't, but that space fence surveillance system radar, that's really a finer version of other near and mid-orbital space surveillance that we've had to know where satellites are. But with the increasing problem, and this is something we've written about for 20 years, space junk. Knowing what's up, I forget the number of pieces of significant space junk. You'll see figures of 60 and 80,000. You'll see them in the 100,000. But big enough pieces of junk that if they hit something, a satellite, they could knock it out. Potentially coming back. I mean, the really big ones like the Skylab and some of the other ones could do damage on Earth. But I think this gives us, U.S., an advantage in tracking debris. Now, in my own thinking about that, and some of this is informed by the 4 years that I was a reserve officer at the old Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, and I'm not speaking about any program that I was involved in or even given peripheral knowledge about it, but just thinking about it. If you know where the debris is and you want to create a cheap offensive capability, you can mask some of these smaller satellites. And Jim was talking about CubeSats. To mask them as a potential space-based anti-satellite weapon. And I just, for one thing, is that right now we have situations where working satellites suddenly go blind. Sometimes they explode. The explanation is, well, they ran into a piece of space junk. That's probably right. I may have been something internal too within it. But you guys see what I'm sketching, and this is the kind. This is almost like a guerrilla operation in space. If we can think of it, if I can think of it, somebody in China thought of it, 15 years ago. And the thing is, I thought about it about when in 99, 2000 or so. But it's also an example of conceptualizing what are the tools you need if you're going to fight a space war, and what is a tool that is cheap and cost effective. Jim spent a lot of time today mentioning SpaceX's cost advantage. It really is. It really is significant. We can afford to send missions to repair and replenish. Now, the last thing I'll mention is SpaceX. X-37B. Well, the X-37 has been a puzzle for me. I always thought it was more than a robotic shuttle. It looks like it could be a Air Force space combat robot, and we have that thing up. We've had an X-37 in orbit for over 2 years in various places. One just came back recently, right, Jim?
Yeah.
I forget. Yeah.
In fact,
Okay.
just went up again.
Oh, it went up. All right.
Yeah.
But how many of them do we have? I don't know. But,
we have two. We have two actual vehicles, and they don't go up right away. They take a couple of years to get upgraded and refurbished and what have you.
All right. We have two we know about. All right. But and I'm not playing silly about that. It seems to be a very robust system, and it's launched satellites, and I know who knows what else it's engaged in. Every once in a while, the Air Force mentions it, and it gets publicity when it takes off and publicity when it lands. So I suspect, and I wouldn't say this with just rah look at us. I think we've got some not just technological advantages, but operational experience advantages in systems that could be upgraded to more sophisticated warfare platforms, not using the kind of guerrilla technique that I sketched with, hi, we're faking space debris, even though that could be extremely effective, but one that could be carrying other types of interceptors and advanced electronic weapons, even beam weapons. I'll leave it at that and see what Dunnigan has to say about that. What do you think about that, Jim? Beam weapons?
Possible, but I tend to be of the you go to war with what you got right now.
I agree with that.
No. I understand a lot of these weapons, could be game changers, but right now I'm talking about the edge we have right now. Nobody really planned on SpaceX coming along, and that's the advantage of the private sector. The Chinese, to a certain extent, have that. They do it in the military, and for example, there are a lot of weapons that their Norinco and other firms, there's 3 or 4 big guys, that are basically developed and produced for export only. And then that gives the army, the Chinese military, a chance, A, to see how the foreign users do with it, and to get a couple of samples, which the manufacturer is happy to provide, to try it out for themselves. And that's basically giving them a big edge, because they don't have to worry about, like the Russians did, you got one, all right, you might have a couple of different design bureaus, as the Russians like to call them, but basically you only had one management team, running the whole shebang, and that led to a lot of delays and lack of innovation. So the Chinese learned that lesson, from the West. They studied the West, and they have been, especially over the last 10 years, they've been transiting away from all their old Russian Cold War era stuff and replacing it with, as quickly as they can, Western-style designs. Like, for example, their new warships, their new destroyers are more and more similar to the Burks. The tried and true destroyer, which is our primary destroyer, and not to the Zumwalt, the contractor bonanza that, like many other projects, the B-2 bomber became too expensive, to produce in more than, sample quantities. So the Chinese are looking at space the same way, and they were surprised by SpaceX. Again, their scientific community in the space area was aware of that possibility, and they've been tinkering with it, but none of the manufacturers felt bold enough, as it were, or confident enough to go out and do it. So it was sort of a surprise. But for scientists and engineers in the business, the reaction to SpaceX was more along the lines of, it's about time. Isn't that a wonderful surprise?
I totally agree with that. It's somewhere on our website is a column I wrote after I interviewed Elon Musk. The column doesn't at all reflect the conversation we had. And my memory, we talked almost 45 minutes. I mean, he gave me as much time as I wanted. We went off all kinds in all kinds of directions. The thing that he impressed me most about him is the guy is an example of a combined pragmatic dreamer, dreaming pragmatic. He says he really had an operationally executable vision of how he was going to build SpaceX and where it was going to go. And we were talking about, well, I came up with the term, and since then another fellow has used it, but it's not, it's any big deal. I said, well, you're Space 4.0, and he, we chuckled a little bit about it. Well, you get, I mean, it's just quip stuff. It's kind of quip anybody can come up with, but Jim, and you know this, Dan, it's an example of what a free enterprise society can do when you have somebody, he's got the economic assets, all the money he made from his other businesses, and he saw the opportunity. I got to talk with Hans Mark, who was one of our top rocket guys, later the head of the Aeronautical Engineering Department at the University of Texas, and also the Chancellor of the U.S. system. But I mean, he was, at one time, I think Dr. Mark was Deputy Director of Goddard. So yeah, there's a rocket man from the glory days of NASA, and his comment on this, I didn't use it in that particular column. His comment on this is that, hey, Austin, this really is the future. What Musk and other guys are doing, they're doing in the commercial sector what we were doing in the 50s and 60s, except he says, you got to realize we were tapping the creative capabilities of our commercial systems. We'd come in and look at, well, what does Northrop have? What does Grumman have? And tell them, okay, you're ahead on this. We'll buy that right off the shelf. He says you don't read. Dr. Mark said you don't read a lot about that in the histories. But we were living off of what our commercial engineering and design capabilities that had out there in the open market. There were certain things, however, that we absolutely needed, and it was there you got into something, I'm using my words for what Dr. Mark said, where you got into something that's more military-like, where, okay, now the government's going to have to provide money, maybe some lead on what we think we need. But he says what's nice now is that this is back to Dr. Mark's comment on SpaceX, and I'm going to say this conversation took place, guys, 8 or 9 years ago with Dr. Mark. Is that the design capabilities and the knowledge are out there on the commercial market, so he can go find the talent he needs in order to carry it off, and then top it off with the fact that he had a capital resource to do it. Chinese, it'd be very difficult, and everybody can see why now with Hong Kong and the lies with the COVID-19 Wuhan virus. It's tough for them to be able to do it because you need a free exchange of ideas and creative people and the opportunity to make mistakes, which SpaceX did, but they've corrected them, and they could go out and we had this problem. Go find somebody who knows how to fix it, or we'll figure out how to fix it because we're testing it ourselves. The Chinese have the problem of we're going to lose face if we admit to our failures. That wasn't the problem with SpaceX. You had all these entrepreneurs in there says, well, we expect this sort of thing, and we've already programmed for it financially. Not to saying it's coming easy, but the programmer, that have the capital and time to correct it. So there's a systemic advantage. Again, I'm not going rah-rah. Just take a look at the situation. Can they steal it? Jim, you've already talked about that. Yeah, they can steal technology. They can steal some of the ideas. can they manufacture it to the quality we can? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. You know more about that than I would.
China has a problem with the with getting that innovation. It's a cultural thing. The Chinese are great at learning, calculus at an early age, but thinking outside the box is something that is never encouraged. Now, they've tried to get away from that, in part by sending a lot of graduate students to American schools, to doctorate programs. What we didn't realize for a long time is a lot of them were acting as intelligence assets as well, some unknowingly, but they all came back and got debriefed by the MSS, the Secret Police, the Intelligence Directorate. And that was the 1,000 grains of sand. You take all these little bits of information, so they had these huge databases of little bits which can be reassembled, and they can basically make something. Now, that is basically playing into their cultural capabilities. But they still have a hard time finding the spark. And that's been a problem with a lot of other cultures. It's always been the advantage of the United States. Now, nobody's really been able to define exactly how that came about. I think it's a lot of it has to do with the entrepreneurial attitude, which is constantly under attack.
Well, that's a point. That's a point I made that was clear to me from that interview with. I didn't mean to interrupt on that, from Musk. Entrepreneurial attitude. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, it's been easier in the United States for a long time to do that. The Air Force, for example, one of the ideas they had, which may never go very far, was to allocate money for the next generation fighter jets to several smaller contracts for contractors to basically come up with whatever they can. What they were trying to recapture was what happened until, I guess, through the 60s and 70s, where you had a lot of new aircraft being produced. Now, this is basically an offshoot of what happened in World War II. We were coming up with new aircraft literally within months, and some of them were outstanding. I mean, the first P-51 was a so-so ground attack aircraft, but adding a new engine and making a few other tweaks, and you had one of the best, prop fighters in the world. Jets, a little more of a problem because nobody was willing to take the kind of chances they took with prop aircraft. But there were a lot of jets by the late 50s, 60s. They were turning out new models of jet aircraft. But where we ran a clapper, and a lot of aircraft industry, executives, were very aware of this, and they pointed it out. Back then, you could basically criticize more freely to this degree. And they pointed out the Air Force has become obsessed with not making mistakes, which is suicide if you're trying to develop new technology, and developing new technology. Because the key to the World War II and the post-World War II rapid development of new aircraft was basically just turning the engineers and pilots loose to do, especially the pilots. Involving the pilots is important because they're going to fly these things. So they have skin in the game, literally. And to develop it like that with the two groups, right there working hand in hand. And that's one reason why the Air Force for years have been sending a lot of pilots to aeronautical engineering courses, but they never developed a culture that could let them really, go wild. Now they're trying to bring that back, but it's hard. It's difficult. Once you've got this bureaucratic culture where, again, the what they call the safetyism. I think it was what they're calling it now. We're seeing a lot of that, in politics. You don't. For example, current President Trump, he's an entrepreneur, and he's anathema. The one reason he ticks off the establishment is because he's willing to take chances. He's willing to do the most gentlemanly thing of all and get things done. Because the ancient saying in the Chinese bureaucracy, and they invented government bureaucracy, was the object is not to win or lose, but to keep the game going. And one of the bits of Eastern philosophy we picked up unknowingly, well, Mr. Parkinson may have noted it, but I don't know if he ever attributed it to the Chinese, was a self-perpetuating bureaucracy whose main goal is simply to keep itself going as a bureaucracy and not to really, do what they say they're going to do. So we're dealing with space technology especially, we're dealing with not just the assets we have, the manufacturing plants, the designs we currently have, the equipment we really have, but the ability to innovate quickly enough or quicker than the enemy. There was that Air Force officer, crap, I forget his name. He was the decision-making loop when they were trying in the 50s to figure out what made an ace. And basically it came to the same thing that makes a great basketball player, a sense of where you are. Somebody wrote a book with that title once. But
Colonel Boyd, are you talking about that Boyd? Is not the fellow's name that you're...
Yeah. Anyway, he got, God that bless him, he got credit for that. But it was a very fundamental idea, which basically sunk into the Air Force, and it influenced their aircraft design. That's, for example, what makes the F-35 such a capable aircraft, even more so than the F-22. Now, a lot of journalists or a lot of non-aircraft designers don't get that. They're still looking at aircraft in terms of World War II or Cold War parameters. They didn't even apply during the late Cold War. It was all a question of being able to know where you are and react quickly. For example, it was revealed at the end of the Cold War when all the Russian secrets could come out, both the ones we discovered and the ones the Russians had still held on to, was that one of the huge advantages of Western aircraft was they were built to be flexible. In other words, to rapidly maneuver. The Russians had the hard statistics. That's why on paper, their jets looked like much more formidable aircraft. But in combat, it was the ability to rapidly adapt. And that means not just in terms of thought, but in terms of maneuverability. Not how should I put it, theatrical acrobatics, but simply, for example, to transit, from one type of movement to another. Energy addition, they were calling it, in the 70s and 80s. And the Russians tried to master that with their Su-27 and their MiG-29 generation, and to a certain extent they got it, or at least they got a lot closer than before. But it's the same thing in any technology. The innovation is what makes it superior. And I pointed this out years ago when comparing the B-17, the most frequently used, and the B-24 bombers, heavy bomber during World War II, with the F-4, which came about late 50s, early 60s. They both, the F-4 had a two-man crew. It weighed about the same. It carried about the same bomb load, or actually a higher bomb load. It weighed less than the B-17, and it was more expensive. But what you were paying for was knowledge acquired and maintained, kept, not thrown away over the years. And when they got up to the F-22, they got so obsessed with the stealth that they failed to realize what was really important in the aircraft, and the F-35 did that. The data fusion and the awareness, and all the pilots who get into the qualify and fly the F-35 from whatever country they come to, they come back, praising to the high hills the fact that this aircraft gives you more awareness of what's up there than any aircraft before. Now, it's not because it's faster, because it can turn, cartwheels or, just turn inside the other guy's, turning circle. It's because you spot the enemy before he spots you, and you spot him with a big advantage. And this is something that the civilians, and especially the journalists, had a hard time accepting. The fact that future air combat is not going to involve dogfighting. Dogfighting is the exception, not the rule. It's been that way for years, decades. You're going to get off a long-range shot, and the enemy's going to be blown out of the air before he realizes you're even around. And then you're going to go on to the next target. And this is the same thinking that you have to apply to space operations, the CubeSats. Now, the X-37B, what's interesting about that is most of its missions, and the latest one went off a couple of weeks ago. I think that's the sixth in the last decade. And they're lasting longer and longer. The next one is liable to last, for a couple of years or more than a year. is what they're doing up there and how they're doing it and coming back. Because one thing the amateur astronomers, the amateur satellite spotters, and the huge community connected via the internet, which have become very useful in tracking formerly hidden or secret satellites, is the X-37B has been doing some strange stuff up there. Now they can spot it. It's in a low orbit, and there are enough people searching the skies. Found it. And but if you get that message, 48, 72 hours later, it's gone. So the question is, how much fuel are they carrying? They won't tell you that. What does it cost to make a orbital, change position? They're not saying that. And it does have a cargo bay, but they're not saying exactly what's in there. They'll throw out some crumbs, a few experiments that are not top secret. But it's the secret experiments they're doing, and the fact that they've been doing this for a decade, and the missions have been getting longer and longer, and every one of them has returned under its own control. It's a robotic landing system, and a tweak, basically, improved, as it were, not just refurbished, and sent up, a year or so later when the first one comes back. They keep talking about building larger ones, but apparently they're getting so much out of the two X-37Bs they got that they don't see any reason to build a larger one when they're getting everything they need from the one they currently have. Now, that's something we're not going to know about, exactly what is coming out of the X-37B, until that technology developed there comes out somewhere else, and people say, well, where'd that come from? And it either leaks out or they basically say it, X-37B. So this is the kind of innovation that bothers the heck out of the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, the Chinese ran that KillSat experiment, where they basically rammed one of their defunct satellites and created this huge debris. By the way, with better, better instruments, they can now spot over 200,000 pieces of debris that are capable of doing damage. The one thing we have to our advantage is that there are literally 1,500 layers of orbital space. In other words, that have enough space, are tall enough, as it were, for a satellite, any object to operate safely. And each of those contains, I don't have it in front of me, but it contains like 600,000, cubic centimeters of space. So it's a vast space up there. But I think, as Austin mentioned, a lot of the orbits are used again and again. So the key is not so much to get rid of the space debris, which is not a trivial task, but people keep working at it, but it's how to find ways to use efficiently the less favorable orbital layers, because you got plenty of space up there. In fact, what a weapon for a Space Force weapon would be one which would basically saturate a layer that the enemy is using a lot of, and they might catch on to this if they notice more and more of our satellites are going up and avoiding, layer 917 or 918 or whatever the case may be. But that is a tactic that is certainly doable if you have the technology to both, poison the layer and also to keep your satellites out of it. And of course, that's where maneuverable satellites, that's where satellite repair and refueling is such a holy grail. Space Shuttle was supposed to do it. They talked about it. They actually did it a couple of times, but it's so hideously expensive. And that's another bugaboo with the engineering community. They said, basically, when the Man on the Moon project was out, they pointed out even then that we could do it a lot cheaper and a lot quicker if we just used robots. Putting people in those ships is hideously expensive and complicated. But if you're just sending robots up there, as we've shown with the Mars landers and I think there's one on the moon as well, these things last, not forever, but longer than they're supposed to. I think there's one up on Mars that's 10 years or something like that. It finally went dark, or it's intermittent. But anyway, that's the kind of technology that is a lot cheaper, a lot easier to send into orbit or send into Mars, as the case may be, and will bring back a lot more information. No, not basically boohooing the benefits of finding out what people in space suffer from and what it takes to keep humans in space, but for orbital research, you don't really need humans up there. I mean, that's just a propaganda thing. And the engineers just go nuts. They're saying, yeah, that's all very nice. And yeah, being an astronaut or a cosmonaut or a taikonaut, if you're Chinese, is a big deal. It's easy to, the ladies love it. But if you simply want to get work done, send the droids.
There is one argument that I have heard for a larger version of an X-37, Jim, and that would be, I don't know. Well, it's you'd be able to certain kinds of satellites. You move them into the bay of the of the ship for robotic repair inside. In other words, maybe even modernization, and then pop it back out. I mean, that's not a fantasy if you had the space to do it with some of these more valuable. Within the repair craft to do it. It might be worth having a robot to do that. So
they already had the X-37C. The whole thing is the robotic technology. Now they've got that. Yeah. They've done some limited repairs and refueling, but again, it comes down to things you never hear about. The robotics. And people, that's one of those things like nuclear power. Oh, robotics, you don't want the robots will take over. Well, I don't think a lot of satellite repair robots are going to rule the world.
No, they're not. They're not.
But they're not. Give a journalist on a slow news day wanting to do a story on space, and he'll.
I can see it. The malign droid builds its own beam weapon, and
right.
That's it. There you go. There's your plot right there. Well, hey, Dan, I think we've covered a lot of it.
Yeah, I think we've hit the point of diminishing returns there with the robots taking over space.
Malign robot, yes.
Yeah. But bottom line, the best space force is a robotic space force.
Right. All right, we'll talk to you gentlemen next time. Bye.
Take care.